keyword intro reveal, Wootz. Sometime in the early 8th century, he stacked it with 100 others like it inside a small earthen furnace, and he set the fire. What came out of that crucible 8 hours later was a small ingot of a metal that the smith called Wootz. It weighed about a pound. It was, by every measure that mattered in the 8th century, the finest steel in the world. And for the next 1,000 years, the small workshops scattered across the southern Indian plateau would forge that metal, ship it west by camel and by boat, and supply, almost single-handedly, the great metalworking cities of the Islamic world. This is the slow story of how those crucibles were fired. Settle in. The Wootz tradition began with the iron in the ground. The Deccan Plateau, the great triangular highland that fills most of central and southern India, is one of the iron-richest landscapes on Earth. The basalt that forms most of the plateau weathers slowly into a red lateritic soil that, in places, contains as much as 50% iron by weight. In the river valleys where this soil is washed and concentrated by the monsoon, the iron is even higher. A child wading in the streams near the village of Konasamudram, in what is today the state of Telangana, will come out with sand caught in the seams of their clothing. Sand, that is, when you put a magnet to it, almost pure magnetite. The Deccan smiths had been working this iron since at least the 6th century before the Common Era. They knew which streams ran black with magnetite. They knew which terraces, dried in the sun, gave the best ore. They knew the difference between an ore that would forge cleanly and an ore that would leave inclusions of slag in the metal. The knowledge was old. By the 8th century of the Common Era, when the Wootz crucible technique reached its mature form, the smiths of the Deccan were working with about 1,000 years of accumulated tradition. The crucible technique itself was a development from an earlier process called bloomery smelting, which is the technique you use when you want to make iron out of iron ore in a furnace that is too cold to actually melt the iron. In a bloomery, the iron forms as a spongy mass. The bloom, that has to be hammered out while still hot to consolidate it. Bloomery iron is what most of the world made for most of history. It is the iron of the Iron Age in Europe. It is what a Viking sword is made of. It is, with various refinements, what almost every iron tool was made of before the modern era. The Indian crucible process did something different. It melted the iron entirely. It produced a true cast steel ingot with a uniform composition all the way through. And it did this in a furnace that was, by the standards of the 8th century, not particularly remarkable. A small earthen kiln, a goatskin bellows, charcoal as the fuel. The trick was not the furnace. The trick was the crucible. The crucible was a small sealed clay vessel. Inside, you placed the ore in the carbon source. Then you closed the crucible and fired it. Inside the sealed vessel, the iron melted at a lower temperature than it would have in an open furnace, because the carbon dissolving into the iron lowered the melting point. And the carbon dissolved into the iron in a controlled, narrow range because the system was closed. No extra carbon entered, no carbon escaped. What went into the crucible came out, transformed. This was a chemical reactor. A reproducible, sealed, batch chemical reactor. In the 8th century, operated by feel. The recipe for a Wootz crucible, in the form that survived into modern memory through the work of 19th century European travelers who interviewed the last smiths, was this. You took a measure of crushed iron ore, between half a pound and a pound, depending on the size of the crucible. You added charcoal in a precisely judged proportion. The ratio of charcoal to ore mattered. Too much charcoal, and the metal came out as cast iron, brittle, unforgeable. Too little, and you got a soft steel that did not have the property the smiths called poulard, that did not hold an edge. You added a handful of green leaves. The leaves were the part of the recipe that most fascinated the Europeans who tried to reproduce Wootz in the 19th century. The smiths had specific preferences. Bamboo leaves were common. Cassia plant leaves were preferred for the finest grades. Avaram leaves were used in the workshops of Mysore. The point of the leaves, the smiths said, was that they fed the fire, that they gave the metal its quality. The Europeans assumed this was folklore. It was not folklore. The leaves, when burned inside the sealed crucible, released organic compounds that contributed not only carbon, but also trace amounts of phosphorus, nitrogen, and certain plant-specific elements that affected the way the carbon distributed itself in the cooling iron. Modern analytical chemistry, when it eventually examined surviving Wootz ingots in the 1990s and 2000s, found traces of vanadium and molybdenum that came from the soil the plants had grown in. These trace elements, at concentrations of less than 1 part in 1,000, were essential for the formation of the carbide structures that gave Wootz its property. The leaves were carrying a fingerprint of the soil. The soil was telling the steel how to organize itself. You sealed the crucible. The seal was made of wet clay, sometimes mixed with cow dung for tensile strength. The clay closure had to be airtight because the entire point of the process was to isolate the contents from the outside atmosphere. You stacked the crucibles in the furnace. A furnace might hold 50 or 100 crucibles at once, packed close. You lit the fire. And then you waited. The firing took between 4 and 8 hours, depending on the size of the furnace and the skill of the smith. The temperature inside the crucibles, at the peak of the firing, reached about 1350 degrees Celsius, high enough to melt the iron, given the carbon dissolved into it. The smiths judged the firing by the color of the fire. There is no thermometer in this story. The Wootz smiths of the 8th century did not have thermometers. They had eyes, and they had a lifetime of looking at fires. A fire of a particularly yellow-white color meant the crucibles were at the right temperature. A fire that was too red meant the smith had to add charcoal. A fire that was too white meant the smith had to ease back on the bellows. The color of a fire at the temperatures the smiths were judging depends on the chemistry of the flame, the thickness of the charcoal bed, the moisture content of the bellows air, and the time of day, because firelight looks different at dawn than at noon. A new apprentice, watching his master make these judgments, might take 5 years to begin to read the fire reliably, 10 years to read it as well as his master, 20 years to read it well enough to teach. This is what people mean when they say that a craft tradition is in the bodies of the people who practice it. The Wootz process could be described in writing as heat the crucibles to roughly 1350 Celsius for roughly 6 hours. But that description, written down on a page, is not enough to make Wootz steel. The description does not tell you what to do when the wind picks up and the bellows draws less air than expected. The description does not tell you what to do when the charcoal you have today is from a younger tree than the charcoal you had yesterday and burns differently. The description does not tell you what to do when one of the crucibles, partway through the firing, cracks under the pressure of the gases inside it, and releases a faint plume of black smoke that, if you do not respond to it quickly, will ruin the whole batch. Those things are not in the description. They are in the smith. After the firing was done, the furnace was allowed to cool slowly for 1 to 2 days. The cooling was important. A quick cool would shatter the clay. A slow cool would set the iron in the right phase. The smith opened the furnace, lifted out the crucibles, broke each one open with a small hammer, and inside found, at the bottom, a small dense steel ingot, about the size and weight of a hockey puck. That was a Wootz ingot. That was the raw material that, in the workshops of Damascus and Aleppo and Isfahan, would be forged into a sword. The Wootz ingots did not stay in India. From the 8th century onward, they were a major item of the long-distance trade that ran from Hyderabad and Mysore and the small workshops of the Deccan plateau, north and west, into the markets of the Islamic world. The trade route ran by camel from the southern Indian ports to Karachi and to Surat, by ship around the Arabian Peninsula, by camel again from the ports of southern Iraq up the Tigris and the Euphrates, and overland to the workshops of Aleppo, Damascus, and Isfahan. The journey from a crucible in Konasamudram to a forge in Damascus took, depending on the season and the political situation, somewhere between 4 months and 18 months. The ingots were small and light and high value, and they traveled well. The Islamic geographer Al-Idrisi, writing in the 12th century, listed the centers of Indian steel production by name. He named Hyderabad. He named Mysore. He named several smaller villages on the Deccan that produced for export. He noted with admiration that the steel of these villages was the finest in the world. He did not describe the process, because he was a geographer, not a metallurgist. But he knew, in the 12th century, that the steel was Indian, and he knew where in India it came from. By the 18th century, this knowledge, the geography of where Wootz came from, had been forgotten in Europe. When European metallurgists in the 1700s tried to track down the source of the Damascus blade, they wrote in their journals and their papers that the steel came from the East, or the Orient, or vaguely India. But the specificity of which villages, which streams, which crucibles, that specificity had been lost. And it had been lost in part because the European trade in Damascus blades had always run through the workshops of Damascus. The European buyers had never gone to India. They had gone to Damascus, bought the blade, taken it home. The workshop in Damascus knew where its ingots came from. The European buyer did not. When the workshops of Damascus closed and the chain of memory broke, the European who wanted to reproduce the steel found himself a very long way from the source of the ore. He could not even find in the 1700s which Indian villagers he should have been asking. By the 1860s, when the British colonial administration in India finally got around to investigating where the Wootz furnaces had been, most of the furnaces were already cold. A few of the older smiths were still living. They were interviewed. They demonstrated what they remembered, but the supply chain that had sustained the trade, the ore preparation, the charcoal selection, the apprentice system, the leaf gathering, was already too damaged to restart. The British took notes. The notes survive. They are not enough to make Wootz. The Wootz crucible was, in the language of modern materials science, a small batch chemical reactor that produced a hypereutectoid steel with a controlled distribution of nanoscale cementide carbides, the formation of which depended on trace levels of vanadium and molybdenum, sourced from the soil in which the leaves were grown. The smiths who operated this reactor did not speak this language. They spoke a language of fire color and bellows, rhythm and bamboo leaves. The language they used, in its own terms, was completely accurate. It described with precision exactly how to make the metal. But the language was not transferable to anyone who had not stood next to a working crucible and watched. When the workshops closed in the 18th century, the language did not survive. The words survived in the colonial notebooks of British metallurgists. The practice did not. There is no one alive today who has fired a Wootz crucible the way the 8th century smiths fired it, because there is no one alive today who learned to read the fire from a master who learned to read it from a master in an unbroken chain back to the original technique. Modern attempts at Wootz And there have been many, over the last 50 years, by metallurgists in India and Russia and the United States. Get close. They produce ingots that look like Wootz, that forge like Wootz, that have many of the same micrographic features. They do not, as far as we can tell, exactly reproduce the original. That is the small, quiet thought to fall asleep on. There was a crucible on a red plateau in southern India that produced the world's finest steel for 1,200 years. We have looked at the ingots. We have analyzed the chemistry. We have read the colonial notes. And we still cannot exactly light the fire the way they lit it. Sleep well.